I was just curious, you've been an interviewer and a reporter for several years. What would you say would be your dream interview?
Oh, you know what? I actually am able to talk to people who I want to interview. Like the general, I may have to take extraordinary steps. But I want, because the whole issue of war and foreign relations is around, I want to tell a quick story about one of my interviews with President Obama. The first book I did was Obama's Wars, about his decision-making in Afghanistan and that war. And when I went to interview him, I'd sent a long memo about what I believed happened and ask him questions about why did you do this, how did you feel that this general was doing, did you agree with Hillary Clinton or whoever, Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense, and so forth. And again, this is the advantage of time. I thought before going to interview him, it was on a Saturday morning, that I had to dig deeper, not just sequence and his feelings. I had to get as close as I could to the answer to the question, what did he really feel about war? What was the context for him as Commander-in-Chief? And so brought to the interview a quote from one of the World War II books written by a former colleague of mine, Rick Atkinson, the book called Day of Battle, in which Rick just steps back and writes about war, what it is. And he says the following, and so at the end of the interview, I handed it to President Obama and said, would you please read this? I want to get your reaction. And Obama stood outside the Oval Office and read the following: for war was not just a military campaign, but also a parable. There were lessons of camaraderie and duty and inscrutable fate. Then there were the lessons of honor and courage, of compassion and sacrifice. And then there was the saddest lesson of all, to be learned again and again, that war is corrupting, that it corrodes the soul and tarnishes the spirit, that even the excellent and the superior can be defiled, and that no heart would leave war unstained. And Obama read this, and he immediately said, I sympathize with this view. And then, like lots of people, he had an assignment for me. He said, go read his Nobel Prize acceptance speech the year before. Now, I'd seen the video of his speech, I had read it. Have you ever seen something and read it and not understood what it really meant? I can't tell you the number of times it happens to me, and it's so embarrassing. So I scrambled home, got out his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and there it was. And he said, quote, the instruments of war do have a role to play in preserving peace, and yet that truth must coexist with another, that no matter how justified, war promises human tragedy. The soldier's courage and sacrifice is full of glory, but war itself is never glorious. You may recall it's Winston Churchill who said war was glorious. And Obama said, we must never trumpet it as such. So part of our challenge is to reconcile these two seemingly irreconcilable truths, that war is sometimes necessary and war at times, at some level, always is a manifestation and an expression of human folly. I realized at that moment he really doesn't like war, and at the end of the book I said, he's getting out of Afghanistan, and this is before he really had announced that he was getting out. And so you can dig into these things and get closer to what, I mean, he's saying there, I'm going to avoid a war at almost all costs. I think he's smart enough, let's hope he is, to realize he who wants peace the most must claim for war.
My question is, what do you think about the current whistleblower from the NSA's decision to openly come out and live in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't done any original reporting on it. Again, I say this is somebody who, he's not demonstrated there was an abuse here. A lot of people are saying these programs worked. The president has come out and said they're monitored by the court and by the Congress, and we'll see. We're just going to have to wait. And I don't think it harmed national security. I wrote about these things in Obama's war in a different general way with some different code words. So I'm not sure whether this is something like the Pentagon Papers is going to go down in the history books, but we will have to see. Now, no one asked this question, but I want to answer it. Hillary Clinton, what's she going to do? Now, I got to know her when she was First Lady, and she is a dynamo. I believe, don't know, that she'll wind up running. And I want to tell, there's somebody who's happy about that. And it's interesting, what does Bill really think? I suspect he wants her to run. But I saw, it was about 6 years ago, I was giving a talk like this in Washington, and she was the other speaker. And afterwards, she came over and said, oh, I quote from one of your Bush books. She's a senator at this point, gearing up to run for president. Didn't get the nomination that Obama did several years later. And she said, I quote from one of your Bush books all the time. In fact, I quote so often, I should pay you royalties. I stupidly said no rather than how much. I said, what do you quote? And she said, well, it's the second Bush book, Plan of Attack, about how Bush decided to invade Iraq. And at the end of the book, I said, well, what do you quote? She said, the end. And at the end, I've been interviewing Bush for hours, over 2 days, and he's standing in the Oval Office at the end of the interviews and has his hands in his pockets. And I just asked, how do you think history will judge your Iraq war? And he takes his hands out and throws them in the air and shrugs like only Bush can. And says, history, we won't know. We'll all be dead. Comforting thought. He's ducking the question, but you know, that's the Gerald Ford story I told in a way, that it looks one way, certain era, and it looks quite the opposite 25 years later, so we don't know. And I remember going home after the interview, and my wife said, how was it? And I said, he answered all the questions, but the really good news is I have the ending to the book. Endings are hard to find, and here it's all about how he made this decision, and then the question, how is this going to be viewed by history? We don't know. And so I asked Senator Clay, I said, why do you quote that? And she said, well, George Bush is a fatalist, somebody who just kind of does their thing, and then they almost let others decide. And she said, you can't be a fatalist to be president of the United States. And I said, well, Lincoln was a bit of a fatalist, and she got real intense, almost lamp-throwing intense. And started pounding her fist into her hand and said, you can't think and talk like that and be president of the United States. And I pushed back a little bit more, and she kind of did this, you know, you can't, I'm telling you, you can't. George Washington would never talk like that. Thomas Jefferson would never, ever talk like that. Bill would never talk like that. And so my thought was the new Mount Rushmore, Washington, Jefferson, and Bill. And maybe Hillary somewhere down the line. And so I thought that, you know, Washington, Jefferson, Bill, and I was going to say something, and then I stopped myself because I thought, we won't know. We'll all be dead.